In the early months of 1942, the sun seemed to rise only for the Empire of Japan. A tidal wave of conquest had surged across the Pacific. In a matter of weeks, a century of Western dominance was swept away. The great British naval base at Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, had fallen. The American Philippines, commanded by the legendary General MacArthur, had been conquered. The vast, resource-rich Dutch East Indies were now firmly under Japanese control. To the west, the flag of the rising sun flew over Burma, its shadow threatening the jewel of the British Empire, India. To the south, that same shadow loomed over the continent of Australia. To the outside world, this success was a stunning display of military precision and overwhelming power. But to the architects of the Japanese war machine, the generals and admirals of the Imperial High Command, it was something more. It was destiny made manifest. It was the logical, inevitable outcome of a force they believed to be unique in the modern world, the Japanese fighting spirit. This was not mere patriotism. It was a codified, institutionalized, and brutally enforced doctrine. At its heart lay the concept of Yamato-damashii, the soul of old Japan. It was a fervent belief that the Japanese people possessed a spiritual strength that no foreign power could ever match. A strength they believed was granted by their unique culture and their divine lineage. In the 20th century, this ancient idea was fused with the warrior code of the samurai, Bushido, and reforged into a terrifying tool of total war. The training of an Imperial Japanese soldier was not an education. It was a brutal indoctrination. It was a systematic process of breaking down the individual, only to rebuild him as a selfless, unthinking component of the emperor's divine will. Recruits were subjected to relentless physical and mental abuse. They were beaten by their superiors for the smallest infraction, a practice intended to hammer out all traces of individualism and instill unquestioning obedience. They were starved on long marches to test their endurance. They were forced to perform complex tasks while dangerously sleep-deprived. They were taught that pain was an illusion, and that hardship was a privilege to be endured in the emperor's name. A training manual for the infantry stated their creed with chilling clarity. To die for the emperor is to live forever. Death is lighter than a feather, but duty is heavier than a mountain. The body is a temporary vessel for the spirit. Harden the body, and the spirit will become invincible. A soldier of Japan does not question. He does not retreat. He does not surrender. He advances until he is victorious, or he dies. The ultimate expression of this spirit was the bayonet. While Western armies were increasingly focused on firepower and mechanization, the Japanese army placed a near-mystical faith in close combat. The final, decisive moment of any battle was to be the tsujiki, the charge. The cold steel of the Arisaka rifle's bayonet was considered the purest physical manifestation of the Japanese soldiers' spiritual superiority. And their recent victories seemed to prove them right. At Singapore, numerically superior British and Commonwealth forces had been outmaneuvered and mentally shattered by Japanese soldiers who appeared from the impassable jungle. They fought with a ferocity that defied conventional military logic. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops, despite their desperate courage at Bataan, had been worn down and ultimately overwhelmed. The Japanese leadership looked at this unbroken chain of victories and saw a clear and simple pattern. Their enemies were weak. Not because their weapons were inferior, or their numbers insufficient, but because their spirits were corrupt. They were the products of soft, decadent, materialistic cultures. They lacked the will to endure hardship, the stomach for savage combat, and the spiritual conviction to die for a cause greater than themselves. And in the summer of 1942, as they planned the next phase of their Pacific conquest, they believed their next great opponent was the softest and most decadent of them all. The Japanese doctrine of spiritual superiority required an enemy worthy of contempt. And in the American soldier, they found the perfect subject. The Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence services, the Kempeitai and the Nakano School, had spent years studying the United States. They gathered data, analyzed cultural trends, and formed a detailed and fatally flawed portrait of their future foe. In the officers' clubs of Tokyo and the field headquarters in Rabaul, senior commanders reviewed these assessments with a mixture of professional interest and cultural disdain. To them, the American way of life was not a source of strength, but a fatal pathology. Their reports highlighted America's obsession with comfort and luxury. They noted the high wages paid to factory workers, the prevalence of personal automobiles, and the popularity of motion pictures and jazz music. This was not a society that bred warriors. It was a society that bred soft, spoiled individuals. A staff officer, presenting a brief to the Imperial General Headquarters, summarized the consensus view. The American is an individualist. He fights for himself, not for the nation. His life is valuable to him. He is taught to preserve it, not to sacrifice it. He is a product of ease. When faced with true hardship, with hunger, with disease, with the terror of a night attack, his pampered spirit will break. He will cry for his mother. He will surrender. He is not a warrior. This assessment trickled down through the ranks, becoming an article of faith. Japanese training manuals and propaganda depicted Americans as lazy, overweight, and cowardly. They were portrayed as merchants and farmers, forced into a uniform they did not want, fighting a war they did not understand. Major Kenji Tanaka, a veteran of the Malayan Campaign, recalled the briefings he gave to his junior officers. I told them what we had learned from our intelligence. The Americans provide their soldiers with ice cream and Coca-Cola to maintain morale. Imagine a soldier's spirit so fragile that it requires sweets. We build our spirit with beatings and marches. They build theirs with sugar. Officers would laugh as they read translated excerpts from American training manuals. The American emphasis on limited training hours to prevent fatigue was seen as ludicrous. The concept of morale leave was viewed as institutionalized weakness. The entire logistical train of the U.S. military, designed to provide soldiers with hot meals, clean clothes, and regular mail from home, was interpreted as a critical vulnerability. It was proof that the American soldier was a fragile creature, utterly dependent on a level of comfort that could never be sustained in the brutal reality of a jungle war. One of the most common points of ridicule was the American reliance on machines. The Japanese saw a military that depended on trucks, on bulldozers, on radios, on everything except the soldier's own 2 feet and fighting spirit. A Japanese colonel wrote in his diary, "They cannot move without their automobiles. They cannot dig without their machines. They cannot fight without their endless supplies. Take away their machines, sever their supply lines, and they will be helpless. They will be like a turtle flipped onto its back, flailing, confused, and waiting for the finishing blow." This was the core of their strategic assumption for the coming battles. They would not, and could not, match American industrial production. That was a simple fact. But they didn't believe they had to. Victory would be achieved by shattering the American will to fight. They would use the jungle's terrain to neutralize the American machine advantage. They would use night attacks to sow terror and confusion. And then, at the decisive moment, they would commit to the banzai charge. They believed the soft Americans, confronted by hundreds of screaming soldiers with fixed bayonets emerging from the dark, would do what all individualists do when faced with terrifying, unified conviction. They would panic. Their lines would break. And they would be slaughtered as they ran. In August of 1942, as the first reports of an American landing on a remote island called Guadalcanal reached headquarters, this theory was undisputed. The stage was set for a swift, brutal lesson. But it would be the teachers, not the students, who would learn the most painful lesson of all. The paper tiger they had so carefully constructed was about to reveal teeth of steel. The Japanese Empire, now a vast oceanic domain, was not content to rest on its laurels. From the central headquarters in Rabaul, a single, strategic imperative emerged. The goal was to cut the lifeline between the United States and its vital ally, Australia. If that connection could be severed, Australia would be isolated, and the entire southern flank of the American war effort would collapse. The key to this strategy was an unremarkable island in the Solomon chain. It was a name no one in the American public, and few in the military, had ever heard: Guadalcanal. On its northern coast, near a place called Lunga Point, Japanese construction battalions were working around the clock. They were carving an airfield from the jungle and coral. Once complete, this airfield would become a dagger pointed at the heart of the Allied supply routes. From this unsinkable aircraft carrier, Japanese bombers could dominate the sea lanes for hundreds of miles. In the war rooms of Pearl Harbor, American intelligence watched this development with growing alarm. The threat was existential. The response had to be immediate. And so, a plan was born. A plan of incredible risk and audacity. It was called Operation Watchtower. The tip of the American spear would be the United States 1st Marine Division. They were confident, aggressive, and thoroughly trained in the new arts of amphibious warfare. They were also almost completely green. Few of them had ever heard a shot fired in anger. Their knowledge of the jungle was purely theoretical. And they were about to step into a world for which no training could have ever prepared them. On August 7, 1942, the invasion fleet appeared off the coast of the island. From the decks of the transport ships, Guadalcanal looked almost like a paradise. A stretch of white sand beach, giving way to groves of coconut palms, rising into emerald green hills shrouded in mist. But this beauty was a mask. Behind that thin veil of coastline lay a primordial world. A rotting, green hell of triple canopy jungle, razor-sharp kunai grass, and stinking, blackwater swamps. This was a world of stifling, 100-degree humidity that never broke. A world where the constant buzz of malarial mosquitoes was a harbinger of fever and delirium. A world where the ground itself bred disease, and the jungle's oppressive silence could be broken at any moment by the screams of men. The Japanese soldiers who garrisoned the island already had a name for it. They called it Shima no Sure, Death Island. It was here, in this godforsaken landscape, that the two armies were destined to meet. It was here that the Japanese doctrine of spiritual superiority would collide with the untested will of the American Marine. The island itself would be the judge. And it was an enemy that showed no mercy to either side. The American landing had caught the Japanese completely by surprise. The construction troops and garrison forces on Guadalcanal had fled into the jungle, leaving the nearly completed airfield to the Marines. In Rabaul, the news was received not with alarm, but with outrage. The idea that mere Americans could seize imperial territory was an intolerable insult. The response was swift and steeped in arrogance. The finest troops available, an elite detachment from the 28th Infantry Regiment, were ordered to retake the island immediately. They were known as the Ichiki Detachment, named for their commander, Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were Kessen Shirtai, decisive battle troops. They were veterans of the conquest of Singapore, hardened jungle fighters who considered themselves invincible. Colonel Ichiki embodied the army's contempt for the enemy. He was so certain of the Americans' weakness, so confident in the spiritual power of his men, that he saw no need for caution. His full force was still in transit. But upon landing on Guadalcanal, he decided he would not wait. He would take a fast-moving contingent of just 900 of his best men and launch an immediate night assault. Reconnaissance was dismissed as unnecessary. Superior numbers were deemed irrelevant. One glorious, unstoppable charge would be enough to annihilate the soft Americans and drive them into the sea. On the night of August 21, 1942, Colonel Ichiki found the American perimeter. It was a defensive line established on the far bank of the Ilu River, a sluggish, sand-choked waterway that the Marines had grimly nicknamed Alligator Creek. Waiting for him were men of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. They had spent days digging in, sighting their weapons, and preparing for the attack they knew would come. They had laid barbed wire. They had positioned their Browning machine guns to create perfect, interlocking fields of fire. They had loaded their 37mm anti-tank guns not with armor-piercing shells, but with canister rounds, turning them into giant shotguns. They were not afraid. They were ready. Just after midnight, the jungle erupted. Flares shot into the sky, casting a ghastly green light over the landscape. From the darkness came the screams. Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! Colonel Ichiki's men, with bayonets fixed, charged headlong across the narrow sandbar at the mouth of the creek. This was the moment of truth. The ultimate test of spirit against spirit. The Japanese expected to see chaos. They expected panic. They expected the American line to break and scatter in terror. Instead, they were met with a disciplined, mechanical, and overwhelming wall of fire. The American response was not a frantic firefight. It was a calculated extermination. The Browning machine guns opened up, their steady, rhythmic thumping cutting down the first wave of attackers in seconds. The M1 Garand rifles of the Marine riflemen cracked with deadly precision. The mortars rained down high explosives, turning the packed ranks of the charge into a maelstrom of shrapnel and body parts. And then, the canister shot from the 37mm guns ripped through the Japanese soldiers, shredding flesh and bone. The Banzai charge, the ultimate expression of Japanese spirit, had slammed into a buzzsaw of American firepower. Still, they came on. Wave after wave, driven by their code of death before dishonor, they charged into the meat grinder. They climbed over the corpses of their own comrades, only to be cut down themselves. The creek became a charnel house. The sandbar, a monument to a shattered myth. When the sun rose on August 22nd, the scene was one of almost unimaginable horror. The area in front of the Marine positions was littered with the bodies of the dead and dying. Of the 900 elite soldiers Colonel Ichiki had led into battle, nearly 800 lay dead. The invincible jungle fighters had been annihilated. Colonel Ichiki, his pride and his unit destroyed, took the only path his code allowed. He burned his regimental colors and then committed ritual suicide. For the Marines, it was a grim but validating victory. But for the Japanese, it was a terrifying omen. The first test of their doctrine against the Americans had ended in a catastrophic failure. Their belief in the soft American had been challenged with the most brutal evidence imaginable. And the long, bloody education on Guadalcanal had just begun. The annihilation of the Ichiki detachment sent a shockwave through the Japanese high command. But their core beliefs, hardened over decades, did not shatter. They concluded that Colonel Ichiki had been arrogant and foolish. He had underestimated the enemy's firepower, but not their spirit. The response, therefore, was not to change tactics, but to escalate. They would send more men, better generals, and overwhelming force. They would strangle the Americans, cut them off from supply, and then crush them. But as fresh troops from both sides poured onto the island, the true nature of the conflict began to reveal itself. The primary enemy on Guadalcanal was not the Japanese soldier, nor the American Marine. It was the island itself. The Green Hell. This was a war where the battle lines were not just drawn between trenches, but against a hostile environment that attacked every soldier, every minute of every day. The heat was a physical weight. A suffocating 100-degree blanket of humidity that caused uniforms to rot and skin to erupt in rashes. Metal gun barrels grew too hot to touch. Men, pushed to their physical limits, would collapse from heat stroke. And there was no escape. The nights brought no relief, only a thick, black, sweat-soaked darkness. Then, there was the rain. Not a gentle shower, but a tropical deluge that turned the volcanic soil into a thick, clinging mud that could suck a man's boots right off his feet. Rivers would flash flood, sweeping away bridges and equipment. Foxholes would fill with water, forcing men to live and sleep in a cold, miserable stew. The jungle itself was an antagonist. Its triple canopy roof blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual, gloomy twilight on the forest floor. Vines, thick as a man's arm, snagged weapons and equipment, turning a simple patrol into an exhausting, hours-long ordeal. The ground was a carpet of rotting vegetation, hiding sinkholes and swamps that could swallow a man whole. And the jungle was alive. Leeches dropped from the trees, attaching themselves to any exposed skin. Giant centipedes, scorpions, and venomous spiders infested the camps. Crocodiles, ancient and enormous, lurked in the sluggish rivers. But the most deadly inhabitants were the smallest. The island was a paradise for the Anopheles mosquito, the carrier of malaria. It was a foe that no amount of courage or firepower could defeat. Men would be struck down by shaking chills and raging fevers that left them delirious and completely incapacitated. At the peak of the campaign, malaria and other tropical diseases were causing more casualties than combat. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water and swarms of flies, ravaged the camps of both armies. It was a debilitating, dehydrating illness that left strong men weak as infants. On top of this came the jungle rot. Small cuts and insect bites, in the perpetually damp and filthy environment, would refuse to heal. Instead, they would fester, turning into painful ulcerous sores that ate away at the flesh. For the Japanese, this environment was supposed to be an advantage. They were, they believed, the masters of jungle warfare, spiritually and physically conditioned to endure such hardship. But the green hell did not respect their perceived superiority. And the Japanese had a critical, fatal weakness: their logistics. The Imperial Army's doctrine emphasized fighting spirit over supply. Soldiers were expected to forage for food and endure hunger as a matter of course. On Guadalcanal, there was nothing to forage. The jungle offered no sustenance, only poison. As the U.S. Navy began to win control of the seas around the island, the trickle of Japanese supplies slowed to almost nothing. The Americans, by contrast, were backed by the greatest logistical machine the world had ever seen. It was slow to get started, and in the early weeks the Marines also suffered from shortages. But as the campaign wore on, the balance shifted decisively. While the Japanese began to starve, the Americans began to build. Their Seabees, the construction battalions, performed miracles. They repaired Henderson Field after every bombing raid. They carved roads through the jungle. They built camps and supply dumps. The Japanese had believed that the American dependence on machines was a weakness. On Guadalcanal, it proved to be their greatest strength. It was the key to surviving, and eventually conquering, the Green Hell. The war on Guadalcanal was becoming a new kind of war. A war of attrition. Not just of bullets and bodies, but of calories, medicine, and engineering. And it was a war the Japanese, for all their spiritual conviction, were tragically unprepared to fight. By early September, the Japanese High Command understood that piecemeal attacks were failing. They needed a decisive, overwhelming blow to shatter the American perimeter and recapture Henderson Field. The man chosen to deliver this blow was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, one of the Army's most respected and experienced commanders. Kawaguchi was no fool like Ichiki. He brought with him the elite 35th Infantry Brigade, over 6,000 fresh, combat-hardened troops. He planned a complex, three-pronged offensive. But the main effort, the decisive attack, would be a surprise thrust from the south. His plan was to march his main force on a punishing roundabout trek through the thickest, most unexplored jungle. They would emerge from the one direction the Americans would least expect, and seize the high ground that dominated Henderson Field. This high ground was a long, grassy ridgeline, rising 100 feet from the jungle floor. It was an unassuming feature of the landscape. But in the next 48 hours, it would become one of the most sacred battlegrounds in Marine Corps history. The men defending this sector were led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson. His command was a mix of two elite but exhausted units, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion. They had just endured weeks of brutal fighting elsewhere on the island, and had been moved to the ridge for what was supposed to be a period of rest. But Edson's instincts told him otherwise. He studied the terrain and realized that this ridge was the key to the entire American position. He ordered his men to dig in. The Marines, exhausted and grumbling, obeyed. They carved foxholes into the hard, coral-laced soil. They strung barbed wire. They sighted their machine guns and mortars. They had no idea they were preparing for the fight of their lives. On the night of September 12th, the jungle to their front came alive. General Kawaguchi's men, having completed their torturous march, launched their attack. They came on in waves, screaming, their bayonets glinting in the light of flares. The first assault slammed into the Marine lines, and in the chaos of the night, the Japanese managed to break through and overrun several positions. The fighting devolved into a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle. Marines fought back with knives, with fists, with shovels. Edson, seeing his line on the verge of collapse, ordered a withdrawal to a reserve position further up the ridge. It was a tactical retreat, not a rout, but the situation was desperate. The Japanese now held the forward slope of the ridge. Throughout the next day, the Marines endured probing attacks and sniper fire, all while desperately trying to improve their new defensive line. Edson was everywhere. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, encouraging his men, repositioning units, and preparing them for the hell he knew was coming. His presence, calm and resolute in the face of impending disaster, was the glue that held the defense together. As darkness fell on September 13th, the main Japanese assault began. This was the final push. Kawaguchi threw everything he had at the ridge. For 8 straight hours, the battle raged. It was a primal, medieval scene of slaughter. The Japanese charged again and again, their bugles blaring in the night. The Marines responded with a storm of fire. Artillery, pre-sighted on the ridge's slopes, rained down high explosives. Mortars fired until their tubes glowed red-hot. Machine guns spewed a continuous stream of lead, mowing down the attackers in droves. But still, the Japanese came on, driven by a fanaticism the Marines could barely comprehend. They broke through the American lines in several places. The fighting became a chaotic swirl of individual duels in the dark. The Japanese doctrine was on the verge of success. They had engaged the Americans in a brutal, close-quarters fight where technology mattered less than raw, savage courage. They believed the American spirit would finally break. But it did not break. The Marines, outnumbered and often isolated, refused to yield. They fought from their foxholes until they were killed or overwhelmed. They counterattacked into the teeth of the Japanese assaults. They held their ground with a tenacity that defied every Japanese prediction. By dawn, the slopes of the ridge were covered with the bodies of more than 600 Japanese soldiers. Kawaguchi's elite brigade was shattered. His grand offensive had failed. The Marines still held the ridge. Henderson Field was safe. The battle was a testament to the incredible courage of Edson's men. But it was also a devastating psychological blow to the Japanese. They had thrown their best troops against a tired, outnumbered American force. They had fought on their own terms, a brutal, nighttime infantry battle. And they had been utterly defeated. The soft Americans had not broken. They had not run. They had held. The ridge, forever after known as Bloody Ridge, was more than just a piece of ground. It was the crucible where the myth of Japanese spiritual superiority was burned away in a firestorm of American grit and resolve. The official reports sent back to Rabaul and Tokyo were sterile and detached. They spoke of tactical withdrawals and heavy resistance. They could not, and would not, capture the horrifying truth of what was happening on Guadalcanal. To understand that, one must look at the documents that were never meant for official eyes. The diaries, letters, and memoirs of the Japanese soldiers and officers who were actually there. In these private, often desperate writings, a new portrait of the American fighting man begins to emerge. A portrait that bore no resemblance to the weak, cowardly caricature from their propaganda. The first thing that shocked the Japanese was the Americans' marksmanship. The Imperial Army's training emphasized aggression and the bayonet charge over precise, long-range shooting. The average Japanese soldier was a mediocre marksman. The American Marine, by contrast, was a rifleman first and foremost. He was trained to hit targets at ranges the Japanese considered impossible. A Japanese private, Masanori Ito, wrote in his diary after a patrol, "We move through the jungle and think we are invisible. But they see us. A single shot rings out from a tree line hundreds of meters away, and one of our men falls. There is no warning. No wasted bullets. Just a crack, and then death. They are not soldiers, they are expert hunters. And we are their prey." As the campaign dragged on, the Japanese mastery of night warfare was also challenged. Initially, they owned the darkness. Their skills at infiltration were superb, and they used the night to spread terror. But the Marines adapted with terrifying speed. They learned to hold their fire, to wait, to listen. They set up tripwires connected to tin cans and ration tins, creating primitive but effective early warning systems. They learned to distinguish the natural sounds of the jungle from the unnatural silence of a man trying to creep through it. A Japanese lieutenant, Yoshio Nakagawa, described the change in a letter to his brother. In the beginning, we could slip into their lines like ghosts. We could create panic. Now, the nights are different. The jungle is quiet, but it is a listening quiet. We try to advance, and the silence is broken by a single, aimed shot. Or worse, a storm of machine gun fire erupts from a position we did not know was there. They have learned to see in the dark. They have taken the night from us. But the most profound shock came from the sheer, unrestrained savagery of the American in close combat. The Japanese had been taught that Americans were soft individualists who feared death. They believed that in a hand-to-hand fight, the American would surely break. The reality they discovered in the foxholes of Bloody Ridge and the swamps of the Matanico River was the exact opposite. When cornered, the American Marine did not surrender. He did not break. He fought with a berserker fury that left the Japanese stunned. Another diary entry, found on the body of an unidentified Japanese officer, contained a chilling passage. "I saw a Marine today. He was wounded, his arm bleeding badly. 3 of our men charged his position with bayonets. He did not retreat. He waited until they were almost on top of him. Then he killed all 3 of them. One with his rifle, one with his pistol, and the last one with a knife. He stood over them like a wild animal. I have never seen such a look in a man's eyes. We were told they were soft. They are not soft." This growing sense of dread, this grudging respect, began to coalesce into a new myth. The Americans were not weak. They were something else. Something unnatural. The nickname they gave to the Marines, whispered in the starving encampments deep in the jungle, says it all. They called them Akuma, demons. One soldier wrote a final, haunting poem in his notebook. "The island is a graveyard. The jungle drinks our blood. At night, the demons come for us. They have green skin and eyes that see in the dark. We came here to fight men. But we are fighting monsters." This was the voice of the Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal. A voice of dawning horror. A voice of utter disillusionment. It was the sound of an entire army's worldview collapsing in the face of a terrifying, undeniable truth. The enemy they had been sent to fight, the enemy they had mocked and dismissed, was proving to be more resilient, more deadly, and more savage than they could have ever imagined. The Japanese perception was clear. The soft American they had expected to fight simply did not exist. In his place stood a creature of unbelievable tenacity and savagery. A demon. But these were not demons. They were men. So why was the Japanese assessment so catastrophically wrong? What was the source of this fighting spirit that their intelligence had so completely failed to predict? The answer did not lie in American culture as a whole, but in the unique and brutal subculture of the organization that bore the brunt of the fighting on Guadalcanal. The United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps of 1942 was a small, insular, and fiercely proud institution. It considered itself, rightly or wrongly, to be the elite fighting force of the United States. It was a brotherhood forged in a training regimen that, while not as systematically abusive as the Japanese, was notoriously harsh and designed to foster extreme unit cohesion and an unshakable sense of superiority. From the moment a recruit stepped onto the yellow footprints at Paris Island or San Diego, he was systematically broken down. He was taught that his previous, individual identity was worthless. He was remade into a Marine. He learned that the primary virtue was not his own survival, but the survival of the Marine to his left and his right. This created a bond that the Japanese, with their rigid, top-down hierarchy, could not comprehend. The Japanese soldier fought out of obedience to the emperor. The American Marine fought out of loyalty to his squad mates. And that loyalty, on the battlefield, proved to be the more powerful motivator. Furthermore, the Japanese had grievously misread the concept of American individualism. They saw it as a source of selfish cowardice. In reality, it fostered the very traits they lacked: small unit initiative, adaptability, and creative problem-solving under pressure. When a Japanese officer was killed, his squad would often become paralyzed, unable to act without orders. When a Marine corporal or sergeant was killed, another Marine would instinctively step up to take his place. They were trained not just to follow orders, but to think, to adapt, and to kill. And then, there was the motivation of revenge. Every Marine who landed on Guadalcanal carried with him the memory of a single, galvanizing event. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor was not a distant political event. It was a visceral, personal insult. It was a sneak attack that had violated every American notion of fair play. The desire to avenge the ships burning in the harbor, and the men killed that Sunday morning, was a powerful and unifying force. It transformed the defense of a remote jungle island into a holy war of retribution. The Japanese had expected to fight soldiers. They found themselves fighting crusaders. Finally, the Japanese failed to understand the brutal pragmatism that the American fighting man would adopt when pushed to the brink. The Americans had arrived on Guadalcanal with a conventional understanding of the rules of war. They quickly learned that they were fighting an enemy who operated by a completely different, and far more terrifying, set of rules. They saw that the Japanese did not surrender. They learned, through bloody experience, that a wounded Japanese soldier might be feigning injury, waiting with a grenade in his hand. They saw Japanese soldiers use their own dead as human shields. Faced with such an enemy, the Marines' own sense of battlefield morality underwent a rapid and brutal transformation. The fight on Guadalcanal became a war of extermination. A war with no quarter asked, and none given. The softness the Japanese had predicted was a luxury that the Marines quickly realized they could not afford. Survival depended on being more ruthless, more alert, and more savage than the enemy. The demon that the Japanese saw in the jungle was not a supernatural creature. It was the reflection of their own ferocity, adopted and perfected by an enemy they had fatally underestimated. The American savage was not born in the cities of the United States. He was forged in the crucible of Guadalcanal. He was a product of Marine Corps discipline, driven by personal loyalty, motivated by revenge, and hardened by the absolute necessity of survival in a war without mercy. The failure of Kawaguchi's attack on Bloody Ridge had been a disaster. But the Imperial Japanese Army was not an institution that accepted defeat. Their answer to the debacle was simple: more men, more artillery, and a new, more senior commander. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal to take personal command. His orders from Rabaul were unequivocal. Henderson Field must be taken. The Americans must be annihilated. There would be no more failures. Hyakutake planned the largest, most complex Japanese offensive of the campaign. He had 2 full infantry divisions at his disposal: the battle-hardened 2nd Sendai Division and parts of the 38th Division. A total of over 20,000 men. He also had heavy artillery, including powerful 150mm howitzers, which were laboriously dragged through the jungle. The plan was a repeat of the Bloody Ridge strategy, but on a massive scale. While one force created a diversion by attacking the American lines along the Matanaka River, the main body, under General Masao Maruyama, would conduct another secret, punishing march through the deep jungle to strike the Americans from the south. They would attack the same sector they had before, along the ridge defended by the Marines. The offensive was scheduled to coincide with a major naval bombardment. The Imperial Japanese Navy would shell Henderson Field into rubble, destroying its aircraft and shattering the morale of its defenders, paving the way for the ground assault. This was to be the final, decisive blow. On the night of October 23, the offensive began. The diversionary attack along the Matanaka slammed into the Marine defenses. It was a bloody affair, with Japanese tanks attempting to cross the river's sandbar, only to be destroyed by Marine anti-tank guns. The attack was repulsed with heavy Japanese losses, but it had served its purpose. It had drawn American attention to the west. Meanwhile, in the south, General Maruyama's main force was struggling. The jungle was even more unforgiving than anticipated. The so-called Maruyama Road they had to carve was a quagmire of mud and tangled vegetation. The heavy artillery had to be abandoned. Men, weakened by short rations, began to falter. The attack, scheduled for the 22nd, had to be postponed. Then postponed again. Finally, on the rainy night of October 24th, Maruyama's exhausted and starving soldiers emerged from the jungle and hurled themselves at the American line. The sector they hit was defended by the men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under the command of the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. And in the center of that line was a position held by Sergeant John Basilone and his machine gun squads. For the next 48 hours, this small stretch of the American perimeter became the epicenter of the Pacific War. The Japanese, despite their exhaustion, attacked with suicidal bravery. They came on in human waves, wave after wave, charging directly into the muzzles of the American machine guns and the storm of pre-planned artillery fire. The fighting was a chaotic, hellish nightmare. The rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, slick with blood. The noise was a constant, deafening roar of explosions, machine guns, and the screams of the wounded and dying. Sergeant Basilone's position was at the heart of the storm. One by one, his machine gun crews were knocked out of action. The guns jammed from the mud and constant firing. Basilone, a towering figure of strength and resolve, seemed to be everywhere at once. When one gun crew was wiped out, he would take over the gun himself. When a gun jammed, he would clear it under fire. When his men ran low on ammunition, he personally ran back through the bullet-swept darkness, retrieved more, and returned to the line. At one point, his position was nearly overrun. Basilone fought back with his pistol and a machete, holding the line until reinforcements could arrive. He and his men were a microcosm of the entire American defense. Outnumbered, exhausted, and fighting in horrific conditions, they simply refused to break. They held their ground, inflicting catastrophic losses on the attackers. By the time the sun rose on October 26, the Japanese offensive had spent its force. General Maruyama's proud Sendai Division had been bled white on the barbed wire and machine guns of the marine defenses. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead in the mud in front of Puller's and Basilone's positions. The final gamble had failed. It was the high water mark of the Japanese army on Guadalcanal. They had thrown their best men, their best generals, and their most elaborate plans against the American defenders. And they had been decisively and bloodily defeated. There would be no more major offensives. From this point forward, the war on Guadalcanal would cease to be a battle for victory. For the Japanese, it would become a desperate, horrifying struggle for simple survival. The failure of the October offensive marked a turning point from which there was no recovery. The Imperial Japanese Army's last great effort to seize Henderson Field had been shattered. But for the tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers still trapped on the island, the end of the great battles did not bring peace. It brought a new and more terrible kind of war. A war against starvation. The American naval victories in November had sealed the island's fate. The Tokyo Express, the nighttime runs of Japanese destroyers, could now only occasionally dash in and kick barrels of rice and biscuits overboard, hoping they would wash ashore. Most of it was lost to the sea. The logistical situation for the Japanese collapsed completely. Deep in the jungle, in makeshift, fever-ridden encampments, the army began to die. Rations were cut to a handful of rice per day. Then to nothing. The soldiers, driven by a primal, gnawing hunger, tried to eat anything the jungle offered. They boiled the roots of plants, only to be poisoned. They ate leaves and tree bark. They hunted for insects and lizards. Their bodies began to waste away. The strong, proud soldiers of the Imperial Army were reduced to living skeletons. Their uniforms hung on them like rags. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes, sunk deep into their skulls, held a hollow, haunted look. This was the Jiu, the Hunger Island. And with the starvation came the diseases. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and jungle ulcers ran rampant and unchecked. There was no medicine. Men with raging fevers and uncontrollable dysentery were simply left to die, often alone, in the stinking mud. The Japanese called this the illness of the star. To fall ill was a death sentence. In this crucible of suffering, the iron discipline of the Japanese army began to dissolve. The sacred code of Bushido, the doctrine of death before dishonor, was being tested not by enemy bullets, but by the slow, agonizing torture of an empty stomach. And for some, the code finally broke. For a Japanese soldier, surrender was the ultimate, unthinkable disgrace. It was an act of profound betrayal to the emperor, to the nation, and to one's own ancestors. It was a fate considered far worse than death. But on Guadalcanal, death was not the swift, honorable end on a bayonet charge they had been promised. It was a slow, miserable, and lonely process of rotting away in the jungle. Faced with this reality, a few, and then a few more, began to make a choice. They began to emerge from the jungle, not as fighters, but as ghosts. They would stumble into marine patrols, often delirious from fever and hunger. They were no longer soldiers. They were just desperate, dying men. The Marines, who had become hardened to the point of ruthlessness in combat, were now faced with a different kind of enemy. An enemy who was utterly broken. An enemy who was begging for help. And a strange, unwritten chapter of the Guadalcanal Campaign began to unfold. A chapter of mercy. When a starving Japanese soldier was captured, he expected to be executed immediately. That is what his own army's code dictated. That is what he would have done. Instead, he was met with something that completely shattered his worldview. He was given a K-ration. He was given a canteen of clean water. He was given a cigarette. He was taken to a field hospital where American doctors and corpsmen, the very demons he had been sent to kill, would treat his wounds and his diseases. For the Japanese soldier, this act of mercy was more shocking than any battle. It was an act of humanity that their own doctrine had taught them was impossible. It directly contradicted everything they had ever been taught about the soft, decadent, and barbaric enemy. One captured Japanese officer, after being treated for his wounds and fed, was interrogated. Through a translator, he was asked why his army had so underestimated the Americans. He was silent for a long time. Then he looked at the American intelligence officer, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and dawning realization. He said, "We thought you were merchants. We did not know you were also knights." The numbers of those who surrendered were small. Most of the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal would adhere to their code. They would die from starvation, from disease, or in the final, futile skirmishes in the jungle. But for the few who chose to live, their capture marked the death of one world, and the confusing, unbelievable birth of another. A world where their most hated enemy showed them a humanity their own commanders had denied them. By December of 1942, the situation for the Japanese on Guadalcanal had moved beyond catastrophic. It was apocalyptic. The once proud 17th Army had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. It was now a scattered, starving, and disease-ridden mob, hiding in the deep jungle, unable to fight and unable to escape. Daily, hundreds of men were dying from starvation and illness. The island had become a graveyard. In the brightly lit, well-supplied headquarters of the American 14th Corps, which had taken over command from the 1st Marine Division, plans were being drawn for a final, island-wide offensive to crush the remaining Japanese resistance. American commanders estimated there were perhaps 5,000 demoralized but still dangerous Japanese troops left. But in Tokyo, at the highest levels of the Imperial General Headquarters, a debate of almost unthinkable proportions was taking place. For the first time in the modern history of the Japanese army, they were being forced to consider the ultimate humiliation. A strategic retreat. To the hardliners, the idea was treasonous. The Bushido Code demanded that the men on Guadalcanal fight to the last. To abandon them was to abandon the very soul of the Japanese military. But a few more pragmatic officers, looking at the staggering, irreplaceable losses of men and material, argued that the entire Pacific War was now at risk. Guadalcanal was a black hole, sucking in Japan's best soldiers and elite naval assets, with nothing to show for it but death. To continue the fight was not honorable. It was national suicide. Finally, after a contentious debate, the pragmatists won. With the personal and reluctant sanction of Emperor Hirohito himself, the decision was made. The surviving troops on Guadalcanal were to be evacuated. The operation was given the name coup. It was a plan of incredible daring and deception. To have any chance of success, the Japanese had to convince the Americans of the exact opposite of what they were doing. They had to make the Americans believe they were preparing for a new, major offensive. In late January 1943, the deception began. A small contingent of fresh troops was landed, and they immediately began staging noisy, aggressive patrols against the American lines. Radio traffic was increased, filled with fake messages about reinforcements and attack plans. The Americans took the bait completely. Their intelligence reports concluded that the Japanese were indeed preparing for a final, desperate battle. The planned American offensive was slowed, as commanders grew cautious, preparing to meet the expected Japanese onslaught. Under the cover of this brilliant deception, the real plan went into effect. On the nights of February 1st, 4th, and 7th, a fleet of Japanese destroyers, the veterans of the Tokyo Express, made their final, daring runs to the island. Under the cover of darkness, they moved to the evacuation beaches. The signal was given. From the deep jungle, the survivors of the 17th Army began to emerge. They were no longer soldiers. They were specters. Skeletal men, many too weak to walk, were carried on the backs of their slightly stronger comrades. They were human wreckage, the living embodiment of a shattered army and a failed doctrine. Silently, efficiently, they were loaded onto the destroyers. The evacuation was a masterpiece of naval skill and discipline. In 3 nights, the Japanese managed to rescue nearly 11,000 survivors from their island prison. When the American offensive finally launched in full force a few days later, they found nothing. The Japanese positions were empty. The trails were littered with abandoned equipment, discarded rifles, and the unburied bodies of those who had been too weak to make it to the beaches. The enemy had vanished. For the Americans, it was a strange and anticlimactic end to a brutal 6-month campaign. But for the Japanese, there was no victory in the success of Operation Coup. The evacuation was a stark, undeniable admission of a catastrophic defeat. They had sent over 31,000 of their best soldiers to Guadalcanal. Nearly 21,000 of them would never leave. Most had not been killed by American bullets. They had been conquered by the jungle, by disease, and by starvation. They were victims of their own army's arrogance, and a doctrine that had proven fatally incompatible with the realities of modern, industrial warfare. The ghost fleet of destroyers sailed away from Guadalcanal, carrying the living ghosts of an army that had once believed itself invincible. The morning of February 9, 1943, was quiet on Guadalcanal. The American commanders, General Alexander Patch, declared the island officially secure. The 6-month battle, one of the most savage and strategically decisive campaigns of the Second World War, was over. The cost had been staggering. For the United States, over 7,100 men were dead, including those killed in the naval battles offshore. But for the Empire of Japan, the cost was almost beyond calculation. Over 20,000 of their finest soldiers lay dead, most in unmarked graves deep in the jungle they had failed to conquer. More than 600 aircraft, and their irreplaceable veteran pilots, had been lost. 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers rested at the bottom of the body of water that would forever be known as Iron Bottom Sound. These were not just numbers on a ledger. These were losses that the Japanese war machine, with its limited industrial capacity, could never hope to replace. Guadalcanal was the attritional turning point of the Pacific War. It was here that the seemingly unstoppable Japanese offensive momentum was not just halted, it was broken and permanently reversed. From this point forward, the Japanese would be fighting a defensive war, a slow, bloody retreat that would end in the ruins of their own homeland. But the legacy of Guadalcanal was more than just strategic. It was profoundly psychological. It was here that the foundational myth of the Japanese military, The myth of their spiritual and martial invincibility was utterly and irrevocably shattered. The doctrine that had promised victory through sheer willpower and contempt for a soft enemy had been tested against reality. And reality had proven that doctrine to be a catastrophic delusion. The Japanese soldier, for all his courage and endurance, was not a Superman. He could be killed. He could be broken. And he could be starved. Conversely, the American soldier, and specifically the United States Marine, had established a new and terrifying reputation. The soft, materialistic individualist from the pre-war propaganda was gone forever. In his place stood the demon of the jungle, the tenacious, savage, and incredibly resilient fighter who could not be broken by fear, and who fought with a ferocity that matched, and often exceeded, their own. Guadalcanal established the legend of the U.S. Marine Corps. The names of the battlefields, Alligator Creek, Bloody Ridge, the Matanacaw, became sacred verses in a new chapter of American military history. The campaign created a new generation of heroes, men like Merritt Edson, Chesty Puller, and John Basilone, whose courage would inspire the nation through the dark years of war still to come. The hard-won victory taught the American military invaluable and painful lessons. It exposed the brutal realities of jungle warfare and the complexities of inter-service cooperation. It underscored the absolute necessity of logistical superiority. The lessons learned in the Green Hell of Guadalcanal would be applied, refined, and perfected in the island-hopping campaigns that followed, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. For Japan, the shock of the defeat was so profound that its true scale was hidden from the Japanese public. The survivors of Operation Coup were quietly quarantined, their stories of starvation and defeat suppressed to maintain morale on the home front. But the truth could not be contained within the high command. They now knew. They knew they were facing an enemy who was not weak, but incredibly strong. An enemy with not only overwhelming industrial might, but also with a will to fight that was as hard as the steel forged in their factories. The regret, whispered in the aftermath, was a bitter one. A Japanese admiral, reflecting on the campaign, would later state the lesson with perfect clarity. I can say that the only difference between the Japanese and American soldier was in his belief in the final outcome. Guadalcanal was the place where that belief was transferred. It was the crucible where American doubt was burned away and replaced with the certainty of victory. And it was the abyss where Japanese confidence was swallowed by the dawning, terrifying realization of their own inevitable defeat. The war would continue for nearly 3 more bloody years. But the verdict had been rendered, in the mud and the blood of a remote island that neither side had wanted, but that neither side could afford to lose. The unstoppable force had been stopped, and the world would never be the same.